Do you even know what tango is, or do you only know how to wipe tables? Mocking laughter filled the hall as every eye turned toward the young waitress. Phones pointed at her, ready to record her humiliation. But when the Arab billionaire sneered, "If you can dance tango, I'll marry you right here," she simply stepped onto the floor. The music swelled, and in an instant her flawless tango steps left the entire hall in stunned silence. Olivia stood at the edge of the banquet hall, her hands steady on an empty tray, her plain black uniform slightly creased from a long shift. She was 23, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, no makeup, no jewelry, just a quiet beauty that didn't beg for attention. Her eyes held a steady fire like she had walked through storms and learned to stand taller because of them. The five-star restaurant in Dubai glittered under crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed tables gleaming the air heavy with the scent of expensive wine and perfume. The guests were the city's elite men in tailored suits, women in gowns that shimmered like they were woven from light itself. Olivia had been working here for months, saving for tuition or dodging sharp glances from people who saw her faded shoes and assumed she was nothing. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier, the stares colder. She wasn't just a waitress to them. She was a target, someone to cut down for sport. The night started quietly, or as quietly as a room full of egos could. Olivia moved through the crowd, her tray loaded with champagne flutes, her steps quick but careful, like she had memorized the rhythm of the room. She'd learned to keep her head down, to avoid the eyes of guests who treated her like she was invisible, or worse, like she was in their way. As she poured wine for a table of businessmen, one of them, a heavy-set man with a gold watch that screamed new money, leaned back in his chair, his voice loud enough to carry across the table. "Careful, sweetheart," he said, smirking. "That bottle's worth more than your entire year's salary." The others chuckled, their eyes flicking over her like she was a prop in their little game. Olivia didn't flinch. She finished pouring, set the bottle down with a soft clink, and moved on. Her hands were steady, but the sting was there, sharp and familiar, like a bruise you don't notice until you press it. A woman at the next table, her hair piled high, and her earrings glinting like tiny chandeliers, noticed Olivia's careful movements, and scoffed. She leaned toward her companion, a man with a slick smile and a Rolex, her voice loud enough to carry. "Look at her pretending she belongs," she said, her lips curling. "She's probably never even been to a place like this as a guest." Her companion laughed, swirling his wine. "Bet she's counting her tips to buy better shoes," he said, loud enough for Olivia to hear as she passed. She paused just for a second, her fingers brushing the edge of her tray, the metal cool against her skin. The woman's friends joined in their laughter, sharp like knives thrown for sport. Olivia kept moving, her steps measured, but her shoulders squared slightly, as if bracing for the next hit. The laughter spread low at first, then louder, like a wave rolling through the hall. A man in a crisp white suit, his hair slicked back, his ego practically glowing, joined in. "Look at her shoes," he said, pointing with a smirk, his voice carrying over the chatter. "Did you borrow those from your grandma?" The table roared, glasses clinking as they leaned in, feeding off each other's cruelty. Another woman, younger with an influencer vibe, perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect malice, leaned forward, her phone already in hand. "Honey, you're in the wrong room," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "The staff entrance is that way." She flicked her wrist toward the back, and the laughter grew sharp and relentless. Olivia stood still, her face calm, but her eyes flicked to the side, catching the glint of a chandelier. She adjusted her grip on the tray, her knuckles pale, and kept moving. But the room wasn't done with her yet. "Hey, before we go deeper, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below about what this story is already stirring in you, and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to keep sharing stories like Olivia's, with you, stories that hit home for anyone who's ever been looked down on. All right, let's keep going." Another guest, a wiry man with a thin mustache and a suit that looked a size too big, piped up as Olivia passed his table. "Careful not to trip," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "You're not exactly graceful, are you?" His friend snickered, one of them, mimicking her walk, exaggerating it into a clumsy stumble. Olivia's steps didn't falter, but her jaw tightened just for a second as she stacked empty glasses on her tray. The room's energy shifted the guests, sensing blood in the water. A woman in a red gown, her lips painted to match, leaned toward her companion. "Why do they even let people like her in here?" She whispered loud enough for Olivia to hear. The companion, a man with a bored expression, shrugged. They must be desperate for help. The words landed like a slap, but Olivia kept moving her tray steady, her face a mask of calm. As Olivia refilled a water pitcher at a side station, a young man in a flashy blazer, his hair gelled to perfection, leaned back in his chair, watching her. He turned to his table, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Bet she's dreaming of being one of us," he said, grinning, like she could ever fit in. His friends laughed, one of them snapping a photo of Olivia, her back turned, the pitcher in her hands. Post that, a woman at the table urged, her voice gleeful. Caption, "It dreams bigger than her paycheck." The group erupted, their phones out, some typing, others zooming in on Olivia's plain uniform. She set the pitcher down, her movements precise, but her fingers lingered on the handle, her knuckles white. A busboy nearby glanced at her, his eyes wide, then looked away as if afraid to get caught in the crossfire. Olivia straightened her face, still calm, and moved back into the crowd, the laughter trailing her like a shadow. The band in the corner shifted gears, the soft strings giving way to a bolder rhythm, a tango pulsing and alive, filling the hall with energy. The guests murmured, some tapping their feet, others shaking their heads. "This kind of music," a man in a pinstripe suit muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "It's not for people like her." He nodded toward Olivia, who was clearing glasses from a nearby table, her hands quick and precise. Her shoulders stiffened just for a moment as she stacked the glasses carefully, the clink of crystal barely audible over the music. The Arab billionaire seated at the head of the largest table noticed. His name was Khalid, a man in his 40s, his black suit tailored to perfection, his black and white keffiyeh draped with casual arrogance. He was known for turning every room into his stage, his wealth a weapon he wielded with a smile. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on Olivia, a sly grin spreading across his face. Khalid raised a hand, signaling the band to play louder. The tango swelled, its rhythm sharp and commanding, cutting through the chatter. His table buzzed with whispers, but no one moved to the dance floor. The guests glanced around, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to step out. Olivia, now standing near the edge of the room, glanced at the empty floor. Just a quick look, barely a second, but Khalid caught it. His smile widened like a predator spotting prey. He stood his chair, scraping softly against the polished floor, and waved a hand. "Let's see who dares," he said, his voice carrying over the music, smooth and taunting. The hall turned, every eye following his gaze, straight to Olivia. She froze, her tray half raised, caught in the spotlight of 100 stares, the air thick with anticipation. The businessman with the gold watch spoke first, his voice loud and mocking, cutting through the music. "What you think you can dance, waitress? Do you even know what tango is, or do you just wipe tables?" The table roared with laughter, their glasses clinking as they leaned in, eager for the show. The influencer woman chimed in, her phone, already out recording, her lips curled in a smirk. "Oh, this is gonna be good. If she tries to dance, she'll fall flat on her face." A few others joined in, tapping the table in rhythm, egging her on. "Go on, try it." "Why?" a man shouted, his voice slurred from too much wine. "This'll be the best comedy of the night." The air was thick with their anticipation. Every phone now pointed at Olivia, waiting for her to crash and burn. A woman with a sleek bob and a pearl necklace, her tone dripping with condescension, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked Olivia up and down. "You're embarrassing yourself just standing there," she said, her voice cutting through the music. "Why don't you stick to serving drinks?" The room laughed again, the sound sharp and cruel like glass breaking. Another guest, a man with a loud laugh and a cheap tie, slapped the table. "Bet she's never even heard of tango," he said, his voice booming. "Probably thinks it's a fruit or something." The laughter grew louder, more guests joining in, their voices overlapping, turning Olivia into the evening's entertainment. She stood there, her tray still in hand, her face calm, but her fingers tightening on the metal edge, the cool surface grounding her. As Olivia moved to clear another table, a man in a tailored gray suit, his cufflinks glinting, leaned toward his date, his voice loud enough to carry. "She's got nerve, I'll give her that," he said, smirking. "But nerve doesn't buy class." His date, a woman with a fur stole and a cold smile, nodded. "It's almost sad watching her try so hard," she said, her words dripping with pity. She reached for her wine glass, her rings catching the light, and raised it in a mock toast. "To dreams that'll never come true," she said, her table laughing as they clinked glasses. Olivia's hand paused mid-reach for an empty plate, her fingers hovering, then curling slightly before she continued. A nearby waiter, young and nervous, caught her eye. His face flushed with secondhand embarrassment. Olivia gave him a small nod, barely noticeable, and kept working, her movement steady, but her eyes flickering with something sharp and unyielding. Olivia set her tray down on a nearby table, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was measuring every second. The room's laughter faltered for a split second, unsure as if they sensed something shifting. She smoothed her uniform skirt plain and black, nothing like the glittering gowns around her. Then she stepped forward. One step, then another toward the center of the floor. The hall erupted in gasps and murmurs, a mix of shock and delight. She's actually doing it. A woman whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. This is going to be a disaster, another muttered, already raising his phone. The spotlight swung to Olivia, harsh and unforgiving, bathing her in white light. But her face stayed calm, her eyes steady like she was somewhere else entirely. She stopped in the middle of the floor, alone, the music pulsing around her like a heartbeat. The room's energy crackled, the guests leaning forward, their whispers growing louder. A man in a velvet blazer, his face flushed from wine, called out, "Go back to the kitchen, sweetheart. This isn't your stage." His friends laughed, one of them mimicking her stance, exaggerating it into something clumsy and mocking. The influencer woman zoomed in with her phone, her voice loud enough for Olivia to hear. "This is going viral for all the wrong reasons," she said, giggling. Another guest, a woman with a diamond choker and a bored expression, leaned toward her companion. "She's making a fool of herself already," she said, her voice carrying. "Look at that outfit. She doesn't belong here." The words piled on each one sharper than the last, the room feeding off its own cruelty. Khalid laughed louder than anyone, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He strode to the edge of the dance floor, his keffiyeh swaying slightly, his presence commanding the room. "If you can truly dance tango," he said, his words booming for all to hear, "I'll marry you right here." The hall exploded in laughter, cruel and unrelenting, the sound bouncing off the chandeliers. The socialite woman clapped her hands, delighted, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Yes, let's see this waitress make a fool of herself." She called, her voice sharp as a whip. Others joined in their taunts, overlapping a chorus of contempt that filled the room. Olivia's lips pressed together just for a moment, and her eyes met Khalid's. There was no fear there, no hesitation, only a quiet, burning defiance that seemed to catch him off guard. A hush fell over a few nearby tables as Olivia stood under the spotlight, her silhouette stark against the polished floor. A woman in a silver gown, her face tight with envy, whispered loudly to her friend, "She's just showing off to get attention." Her friend, a man with a goatee and a smug grin, nodded. "Probably thinks this'll get her a better job," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. He snapped his fingers at a passing server as if to prove his own importance, then turned back to Olivia, his eyes narrowing. "Keep dreaming, kid." A few others murmured agreement, their voices low but sharp like needles. Olivia's hand twitched just slightly as she adjusted her stance, her fingers brushing the hem of her skirt. She didn't look at them, but her chin lifted, a small gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, silencing their whispers for a fleeting moment. The music hit a crescendo, the tango's rhythm sharp and commanding like a challenge thrown down. Olivia lifted her chin, her posture shifting, shoulders back, spine straight, like she was stepping into a different version of herself. She took a single step, her foot sliding across the polished floor, with a grace that made the room catch its breath. Then another step, fluid and strong, her body moving in perfect sync with the music. The laughter died, replaced by a stunned hush, as if the air itself had frozen. Her plain uniform seemed to vanish, her movements carrying a power that filled the space. Each step was deliberate, each turn precise, her arms extended with a confidence that silenced the room. The guests leaned forward, their eyes wide, their phones still raised, but forgotten. Khalid's smile faded. He stood frozen, his hands still in his pockets, watching as Olivia danced alone under the spotlight. The music built, and she matched it, her steps weaving a story of strength and control, each movement a quiet rebuke to the room's cruelty. A few guests whispered, their voices shaky. "Who is she?" One woman asked, her wineglass trembling in her hand. The businessman with the gold watch shifted in his seat, his smirk gone, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. The influencer's phone lowered slightly, her mouth open, her perfect facade cracking. Olivia's dance wasn't just good, it was masterful, a performance that belonged on a world stage, not in a room full of mocking strangers. As Olivia turned, her skirt catching the light, a man in a corner booth, his face half hidden in shadow, leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. "This is a fluke," he muttered, his hands clenched around a whiskey glass. She's probably some hired performer planted here to make us look bad. His table nodded, their faces tight, grasping at any excuse to dismiss her. A woman beside him, her hair streaked with highlights, scoffed. No way she's that good. Naturally, she said, her voice loud enough to carry. It's all an act. Olivia's steps didn't falter, but her eyes flicked toward the booth for a split second, a spark of defiance flashing before she spun again, her movement sharper as if answering their doubt with every precise step. The room's energy shifted, the guests' confidence wavering, their whispers growing quieter. The hall was quiet now. The only sound, the music and the soft tap of Olivia's shoes against the polished floor. She spun, her skirt flaring slightly, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. A memory flickered in the air. Not spoken, but there in the way Olivia's hand lingered in a turn, the way her eyes softened for a split second. Years ago in a small apartment, she danced with her mother, the radio crackling with a tango's rhythm, the two of them laughing as they moved across a worn rug. The memory passed unspoken, but it hung there in her grace, in the way she carried herself, like she was dancing for someone who wasn't in the room anymore. A man's voice broke through, sharp and desperate, trying to claw back control. "Impossible," he shouted, his face red, his tie askew. She must have practiced this somewhere, some cheap studio. The socialite woman nodded, clutching her pearls, her voice shrill. Even if she dances well, she's still just a waitress. Others joined in their voices, thin, grasping at their fading superiority. "She's no artist," another man scoffed, his words slurring. "Just a fraud." But their words fell flat, drowned out by the power of Olivia's movements. Each step, a quiet defiance. Each turn a reminder that she didn't need their approval. Another guest, a woman with a sharp jawline and a designer handbag, leaned forward, her voice loud enough to carry. "She's probably faking it," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Anyone can learn a few steps." Her friend, a man with a loud watch and louder laugh, nodded. "Yeah, this is just a stunt. She's still nobody." The room buzzed with their voices, a desperate attempt to dismiss what they were seeing. But Olivia kept dancing her steps, never faltering, her presence growing stronger with each beat. The guests' taunts grew quieter, their confidence cracking as the truth of her skill became impossible to ignore. A new voice cut through the noise. A woman in a sleek blazer, a journalist, her phone already out, scrolling furiously. She'd been quiet all night, watching from the sidelines, but now she stepped forward, her face lit with excitement. "Wait," she said, her voice rising over the music. She held up her phone where a grainy video played on a loop. "This is her," the journalist said, her voice shaking with disbelief. She turned to the giant screen at the front of the hall where the tech crew patched in her feed. There was Olivia, younger, her hair longer, dancing in a competition hall, her name flashing across the bottom. Olivia Harper, two-time international tango champion. The room gasped, murmurs rippling through the crowd like a stone dropped in water. Old photos appeared on the screen. Olivia in a simple black dress holding a trophy, her mother beside her, frail, but smiling, her hand resting on Olivia's shoulder. Another video showed her at 19, her steps just as flawless, her face just as calm, moving through a crowded stage with a partner who could barely keep up. The journalist kept talking, her voice rising with urgency. "She quit dancing to take care of her sick mother," she said, pointing at the screen. "She's been working odd jobs ever since paying hospital bills." A newspaper clipping flashed up the headline, clear, "Tango prodigy steps away to save family." The mockers' faces paled, their eyes darting to Olivia, who was still dancing, oblivious to the screen behind her. As the screen flickered with images of Olivia's past, a man in a pinstriped suit, his face flushed with anger, stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "This changes nothing," he declared, his voice trembling with defiance. "She's still serving tables, not sitting at them." His table murmured agreement, their voices weak but stubborn, clinging to their sense of superiority. A woman beside him, her earrings dangling, pointed at the screen. "Those videos could be fake," she said, her tone desperate. "Anyone can edit a clip these days." Olivia's dance continued, her movements unbroken, but her hand brushed her bun, loosening a strand of hair that fell across her cheek. She tucked it back, her fingers steady, and kept dancing, her silence louder than their protests, her grace dismantling their words one step at a time. The music slowed, and Olivia's movements softened, her final sequence, unfolding like a story coming to a close. She finished with a single step, her foot sliding to a stop, her chest rising and falling, her eyes locked on nothing in particular. The music faded and the room stayed silent, the weight of their shame settling over them like dust. The businessman with the gold watch looked away his hands, fidgeting his napkin crumpled in his lap. The influencer slipped her phone into her bag, her face flushed, her perfect smile gone. The socialite woman stared at her wine glass, her fingers trembling, the pearls at her throat suddenly too tight. Khalid stood at the edge of the floor, his jaw tight, his eyes no longer mocking, but serious, almost searching like he was seeing Olivia for the first time. A man in the back shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's still unworthy of an Arab billionaire. A few others nodded, their voices weaker now, clinging to their pride like a lifeline. "She's just a waitress," another said, but the words sounded hollow, like they didn't believe them anymore. Another guest, a woman with a tight smile and a gold bracelet, tried to laugh. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice thin. "She's still out of place." But the room didn't laugh with her. The air was heavy, every guest holding their breath, waiting for Khalid's response. Olivia didn't move. She stood there, her hands at her sides, her gaze steady, meeting his eyes without flinching. The silence stretched the room, frozen until a soft clink broke it. A waiter dropping a spoon in the corner, his hands shaking as he watched. Olivia's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Khalid, her expression unchanged. Another memory flickered unspoken, but there in the way her fingers brushed her skirt. A hospital room years ago, her mother's hand in hers, the beeping of machines, the faint hum of a tango playing on a nurse's radio down the hall. Olivia had sat there night after night, her dance shoes tucked away in a closet, her dreams on hold. The memory passed, and she straightened her chin, lifting slightly as if shaking it off. Khalid stepped forward, of his movements slow, deliberate, like he was weighing every step. He reached up, removed his keffiyeh, and held it in one hand, the fabric dangling loosely. Then he started clapping a slow, steady rhythm that echoed in the silent hall. In a room full of show-offs, he said, his voice clear and calm, cutting through the tension, "Only you dared face me with true talent." He paused, letting the words sink in, his eyes locked on Olivia's. The room shifted, a few guests gasping, others leaning forward. He bowed slightly, his hand extended toward her. "Dance with me," he said, not a challenge, but an invitation. His voice softer now, almost reverent. As Khalid extended his hand, a woman in a green dress, her face pale, stood abruptly, her chair tipping slightly. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. "She's playing you all?" She pointed at Olivia, her hand shaking, her bracelet jangling. "She's just a server who got lucky with a few lessons." A few guests murmured their heads, nodding, desperate to hold on to their narrative. Olivia's eyes flicked to the woman just for a moment, and she tilted her head slightly, a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible. Then she turned back to Khalid, her hand resting in his, her posture calm but unyielding. The woman sat down, her face red, her words swallowed by the room's growing silence as Olivia's quiet strength outshone her outburst. Olivia didn't smile. She didn't blush. She nodded once, a small deliberate movement, and took Khalid's hand. The music started again, softer this time, the tango's rhythm gentle but commanding. They danced, Khalid, moving with skill, but Olivia leading subtly, her steps, guiding him, her presence filling the floor. The guests watched, some with tears in their eyes, others with their heads bowed, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. The businessman with the gold watch slipped out of the room, his face red, his coat slung over his arm. The influencer's phone stayed in her bag, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. The socialite woman drained her wine glass, her fingers shaking, her laughter long gone. The dance continued, Olivia's movements fluid and sure, each step a quiet declaration of who she was. The room's energy shifted, the guests no longer mocking, but watching, some standing, others whispering in awe. A woman in a blue dress, her face soft with regret, clutched her husband's arm. "We were wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her husband nodded, his eyes on Olivia, his jaw tight. Another guest, a man with gray hair and a quiet demeanor, stood and began clapping slow, at first then louder, until the room joined in the applause, growing into a thunderous wave. Some guests wiped their eyes, their shame mixing with admiration, their earlier cruelty exposed under the weight of Olivia's truth. As Olivia and Khalid moved across the floor, a young server, barely 18, stood frozen near the kitchen door, his tray shaking in his hands. His eyes were wide, fixed on Olivia, his face a mix of awe and disbelief. He'd seen her every shift, quiet and steady, taking the guests' jabs without a word. Now watching her dance, he stepped forward, almost dropping his tray, and clapped his hands trembling. Other staff joined in their applause, soft but growing a quiet rebellion against the room's cruelty. Olivia didn't look at them, but her steps grew sharper, her movements carrying a new intensity as if she felt their support. Their shared defiance lifting her higher. The guests noticed their faces tightening, some looking away, unable to meet the eyes of the staff they'd ignored all night. The music faded, and Olivia and Khalid stopped, their hands still clasped, for a moment before she stepped back. She didn't bow, didn't smile, just stood there, her chest rising and falling, her eyes steady. Khalid looked at her, his expression unreadable, then nodded once, a gesture of respect. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, the applause dying down, the guests left with their own thoughts. Olivia turned, her movements calm, and walked back to her tray, picking it up as if nothing had happened. The guests watched her, some with open mouths, others with heads bowed, the weight of the night settling over them. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.